CCXA, the newest evolution of Claude Cormier and Associates, where Marc first started out as an intern some time ago. CCXA has won many awards for its work, including the Waterfront Hall of Fame Award for Sugar Beach and the Certificate of Merit in Civic Design for Birksea Park in Toronto. Indeed, Birksea Park alone has garnered 8 separate design awards. The firm has been the subject of serious scholarship, featuring in numerous articles and a recent book. Marc himself was recently made a fellow of the CSLA in recognition of his substantial contributions to Canadian landscape architecture. These are, of course, remarkable achievements. But as I looked at the work of CCXA last night, I was captivated by what I could call a pink thread running through their projects from the early lipstick forest to the crimson heart of Love Park in Toronto and the glowing magenta ring of a recently opened installation in La Place Ville Marie in Montreal. It is this reminder that land is not only 6 shades of green and a few earth tones, as we might think from being in this room, but also fuchsia, bubblegum, rose, and cherry blossom that I found most delightful in the work of CCXA, a landscape practice that brings the optimism of pink to the public spaces of the cities it works in. Please join me in welcoming Marc Hallé.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. First, I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you guys. I live in Montreal, but actually I'm a prairie person. I grew up in Saskatchewan, and I was just reflecting. It's my first time in this faculty, but just reflecting that where I grew up, all of the architects are graduates of this institution, of this school, and just seeing the details, the proportions. This is a fantastic building, but the buildings that surrounded me growing up and then excited me about architecture carry the same DNA as this building here, so it's kind of interesting to make that connection. But also, what would have excited me about architecture since my earliest years influences kind of what I'm doing now, so there's kind of a full circle moment that kind of happens, and I'm kind of feeling a bit of a trigger coming here, so it's really exciting. But I just want to maybe introduce a few of just a kind of background where I'm approaching our discussion today, because it's more like a speculation. We're, I guess, transitioning from maybe a bit of a legacy firm from the founder, Claude Cormier, who's still with us. He's just expanded the leadership. So as we move ahead, thinking about where is this firm going to go into the next generations, it's good to kind of know where we started, what is the secret sauce behind kind of maybe the distinct approach that we might approach design through, and how do we communicate to the next generation who hopefully will be able to take the reins. And so we were lucky that last year, I've got a book right here, Serious Fun, the landscapes of Claude Cormier. And it's kind of been a great retrospective to be able to kind of wrap up or kind of put into a frame where we've come from, how far we've gone, and where we might want to be going. And that's something that's really going to be kind of an important foundation for the next sort of leadership and going into the future. But the question I want to kind of maybe provocatively ask is fun. Seriously? We're looking at a time where there's so many issues. I don't think many people look at design from a fun lens anymore, because there's too many serious issues from climate adaptation and biodiversity and racial justice and reconciliation. These are really heavy topics. The conversation is so loaded with so many important issues that implicate design in such a deep way. And you wonder, well, where's the room for the fun? And I think this is what I want to speculate about today, because it is kind of the cornerstone of our practice. I think if anybody's visited a number of our projects, there's a certain whimsy or humor. And not necessarily jokes, though. There's a lot of seriousness and rigor and serious problem solving behind them. But I think in solving problems, I think a lot of the problems we have now are kind of a result of a kind of a didactic logic and then kind of an enlightenment logic, which is important, but it's not the only kind of way that we understand the world. And I think when you, especially from being in this firm for the last 20 years, there's a lot of laughing that happens in the office. And that's usually when you know you're on a good idea, because it engages your visceral sort of intelligence. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how do you kind of, use your brain as maybe the control center, but it's not maybe that doesn't necessarily have the last word. Because I think the problems we need now, especially when they're interconnected with our evolutionary connection with the planet, they need to engage the whole body, the intelligence of the whole body, not just the mind. So I want to start maybe with a few speculations about what would have, our founder, Claude Cormier, what would have been some of the influences that would have shaped this kind of approach. So the first is just, I think it's pretty easy off the cuff to talk about this aspect of joie de vivre, the French-Canadian joie de vivre. And maybe one way just to kind of demonstrate this is, if you look at the landscape painting tradition from landscape painting that comes out of Quebec, it's quite different than what you might have seen in English Canada, their English counterparts. If you look, for example, at the group of 7, it's hard often to find a human in those landscapes. They're almost like a pure contemplation of pure, unadulterated nature. But if you look at landscape painting in Quebec, the natural setting, it's the setting that is the background, it's the mise en scène, the backdrop of a very intense social moment. And it's not to say that one is separate from the other. I think it is kind of a universal unifier. It's the common denominator that unifies the diversity of people, but it's specific to each. And the same thing where the air and the water that are surrounding are also inside of us. So there's kind of this link between the landscape and that social intensity. For example, this is if you take the people out of this painting, that's a very kind of iconic moment in Quebec where there's this kind of long horizon of the St. Lawrence River. But we're not really paying attention to that, are we? There's really an intense bond. This painting is called L'Adieu by Jean-Paul Lemieux. There's an intense moment happening between these two friends. Adieu, they're probably saying goodbye to each other, but you feel an emotion. It gives me goosebumps, not necessarily for the landscape behind it, which is beautiful, but it's more this condensation of this really intense social moment. And I look at our work, and people might think, the work is kind of really strong, and it screams. It's got color, it's got lots of texture, it's got shapes. You can't miss it. Hate it or love it, you're going to have a reaction to it. But when you spend a bit of time in there, it's not about the installation. It's not about the object. It's about what it does to people, how it activates this kind of reaction that goes beyond the brain and engages a certain other senses in your body. And it becomes a backdrop to these intense social moments, and in a way that is universal. So this, for example, color is something that no matter who you are, where you come from, what you believe, or what your education is, color is a universal phenomenon that everybody has an experience and a perception or an opinion of, and can grab onto and make it personal. So it also then becomes a backdrop that is accessible to everybody. Now the second kind of key moment in Quebec history is this, the Quiet Revolution. So for those maybe who don't know what the Quiet Revolution is, it was that moment where, if you might recall if looking at Quebec history, for a long time, the French majority were kind of always in the backdrop. The commerce, the power of Quebec tended to be in the hands of those who control the finance, which is mostly in the hands at that time, especially in Montreal, in the hands of the English. And similar to a lot of emancipation movements that were going on in post-colonial eras in other countries, as colonizers were pulling out, there was a certain moment where the power shift started to take place. And this is a very significant moment. And luckily, the Quiet Revolution, it wasn't necessarily a violent one, but it was very significant. And one of the sparks that led to it was this group of artists and avant-garde thinkers. They were called les automatistes, led by Paul-Émile Bourdois, who was a painter. He's the one in the center with the cigarette. And this was, I think, in the 1940s, they came up with a very significant and influential manifesto called Le Refus Global. And it was kind of, if you recall, Quebec at that time was very conservative, and I think a long time ago, an idea of seeing a way to preserve the French language and culture was to kind of isolate from the other forces through the church, schools, agriculture. These were kind of the domains of the majority. But there was a moment where they said that we've had enough of this. This is what's holding us back. We need to push back against these conservative forces that are keeping us from really being able to take our place. And just for example, there were surrealists, les automatistes, taking their influence from the surrealists, and it allowed them to go beyond language. Language is kind of a trap of what's possible because everything we know exists in language. But if you want to do something new, you have to go outside that language. So these are kind of the things that they were doing as part of their manifesto. For example, the past is the birthplace of the future. It is far from sacred. We owe it nothing. Some other kind of points from the Refus Global. The present will inevitably give way to the future. We need not worry about the future until we happen upon it. We passed beyond Christianity to touch the burning brotherhood of man, to which religion had barred the door. And this one I think is maybe most significant. Our minds were energized by the poète maudite, like the damned poets, who, far from being monsters of evil, dared to give loud and clear expression to feelings that the most wretched among us had always shamefully repressed for fear of being swallowed alive. So there's this kind of awareness that, there's the human nature is not just pure and moral. It's something, there's something wild. There's kind of an instinctual Dionysian aspect to it that needed to be unleashed. And that's what this group were able to do. Shortly after, though, in a very conservative social context, they were discredited, they were shamed. Paul-Émile Baudoin left Quebec and moved to France because he lost his employment. Life was made uncomfortable for these people. But this is a very significant moment that resulted in very significant changes and influenced the Sidika generation. This is a painting by Paul-Émile Baudoin, very sensual but austere, decadent but almost monastic. And it influenced a whole generation. This is Saucier and Perrot, the Perimeter Institute in the University of Waterloo. And there's a whole kind of generation which I like maybe to call survivors. They were scrappy, impatient, intelligent, fierce, working extremely hard, tirelessly to come up with this expression for this new power dynamic, this new power relationship, and this new cultural reality that was divorced from the one that had preceded it. And this is a very pivotal moment. If you look at 1967, there's still, of course, it's not an overnight sensation where things go from conservative to liberal in a very quick moment, but it did happen relatively quickly. But you had in the same year the conservative forces of the church that were still quite dominant, and then you had Expo 67, where people were breaking out of their habits and going into leaping into modernism. In Expo 67, it went from being an austere moment in the culture to something of extreme exuberance. Modernism was clearly and very rapidly seen as the key to emancipation, participating in this modernist kind of experience that was taking over. And this was a new moment. If you recall, Expo 67 was supposed to go to Moscow to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. They canceled, and then within 5 years before Expo 67 was opened, it was given to Montreal in a very short period of time, and almost in the hands of those who were very naive. What are we going to do with this? And that naivete maybe was an advantage because it led to no assumptions. People were going to extremes to create something new, and the exuberance was unprecedented. And it left a lasting mark. It was a tipping point where in Montreal there was no going back to the past. There was a comfort with modernism, with modern expression and modern values, and it was onward and forward from that moment. So this is maybe some of the historical kind of references. This is Square Dorchester in Montreal, and just talking about that relationship with the past. So there's kind of this divorce from the forces of the past, but also an acceptance that it is part of the reality. It's not something that's shamefully looked down upon. It's incorporated, but maybe through a surrealist lens or interpreted in a way that helps with the modern kind of expression. This was a park, Square Dorchester. It was built in 1876. Just hold on, my finger's a bit too heavy here. And it was the center of the Golden Square Mile, which at that time, at the turn of the century, in about 1900, 90% of all the wealth in Canada was in the hands of the families that lived within 1 square mile of this park. So this was kind of that Belle Epoque moment for promenading on Sundays and kind of participating in that kind of social discourse. But by about the mid-90s, the park had become significantly degraded. 90% of the Canadian wealth is no longer in the hands of Montreal, as I can tell you that for sure. And this neighborhood kind of became derelict. But the city decided to reinvest resources, and we were lucky enough to be able to participate in this revitalization, not just a pure restoration, but a revitalization that took into account many different influences and factors that would make it relevant to a 21st century audience. Now, if you look at this little detail here, see that little kind of detail? That is well, I'll explain to you what that is. This park used to be a cemetery. So in 1876, the park opened. But before that, in around the 1850s, it was a cemetery, and there's still bodies buried in the park. But as a way to commemorate this historical reality, but not in an overwhelming and neither in a precise kind of way, we incorporated these map markers that replicate or represent cemeteries on maps with a little check on the bottom of the cross. These granite crosses inlaid randomly into the bottom of the paving, just as a reference to what lies below, a gentle reminder, a contemporary archaeology approach to quietly and curiously, I guess, raise a question to what's happening below the surface. Another kind of detail that was interesting to point out is if you look at these, in the 60s, a part of the park was excavated to construct an underground parking garage. So we have an in-ramp, we have an out-ramp. And this road was also built. So this park was not only ignored or neglected, but it was also taken apart on the edges. And it was a point where this northern half of the park was going to be restored or reincorporated back into the rest of the park. And again, I think we would look at this kind of insertion of this parking garage as an adulteration of this place. But accepting it, we're not going to change it. It's not going away. How do we incorporate this reality in a way that can make for a curious experience of the park? So restoring that Union Jack diagonal of the original park motif, we incorporated these Venetian bridges. So you just kind of hop over these parking garages. They disappear out of sight because you're way over and you're looking elsewhere. And then the second one was this fountain, located at this spot because that's where the column is to be able to carry the load. But originally the fountain normally would be like a fully 360-degree kind of object. But because of these double-decker buses and other buses coming through, they said, forget it, get rid of the fountain. But we didn't. And so the first reaction, this kind of quirky interrelationship between the pedestrian above and the cars below, used for other purposes like university graduations or eating your lunch. It's a very popular spot within the financial district. And then for the fountain, from the classic perspective of the park, it looks like it fits within the rest of the language. But on the side that was sliced, just taking advantage clearly where we were not allowed to have encroachments where the buses were going to go, we just said, okay, fine, this is actually quite interesting. Let's just slice the park. And now from this point, it becomes then a silhouette and kind of a contemporary expression that makes sense, maybe not in the 1870s, but makes sense in the 21st century. Another example of this kind of contemporary reference to the past is with Place du Ville, which was an early project that our office did in the late 90s. And outside the walled city, there was a river, a little ruisseau, that was going into the St. Lawrence, that was channelized and became then surrounded by city and market. And this was kind of the concept, a patchwork of quilts that connects door to door of buildings that opposite this kind of linear public space. There's kind of diagonals from a door here all the way to the door over there. But it was making reference to the civilization of sidewalks. Some of them were made out of wood, some of them were made out of stone, some out of concrete, some of it asphalt, with a linear kind of passage or promenade that was raised to protect the archaeology below. Again, this kind of is an impressionistic interpretation of the history of the site. And then maybe another example is Place d'Armes, probably the most famous public square in Montreal. And it was the site of the earliest church before the Basilique Notre-Dame, kind of the #1 most postcard moment of Montreal. Before that was constructed, this was the church that proceeded in the 1670s. And it was right along the Chemin du Roi, the principal route between Quebec City that turned into the Kingsway all the way to Toronto. And it was right in the center, trying to maintain this kind of dominant position in the long sort of views down the road. There's the new church getting constructed because this one became too small, but you see this kind of steeple, just keep that in your head for a few moments. But as that church was replaced by the new one, it was demolished. The square became a very important civic space. And similar to the dynamic in Montreal, where the French-Canadian population was building churches, these grand structures for religion, the English were building their financial structures right across the street. The cathedral, there's the Sun Life building across from that, which was currently Sun Life. This one has the banks, the Bank of Montreal and other kind of banks. But what's curious about this moment is that it has kind of representation from all periods of architecture in Montreal, from the 1680s all the way to the 1960s. So it's a kind of a curious condensation of all these different periods in one moment. But where the church used to stand, this is kind of a banal maybe reference. Here used to be a church. We thought maybe we can do better than that. How would we give this historical reference more of a presence or life in the experience of the city? So this is, what does this tell you? This is speed bump ahead, right? And we thought, well, why don't we just maybe make a big speed bump? And the idea of maybe then raising the footprint of that church to be level with the parvis of the Basilique Notre-Dame. And it becomes kind of this civic moment where it could be used for civic purposes. It's mainly used now for tourists, but it could be a place where when the Canadiens, whenever they're going to win, they could broadcast games from this and have the whole sort of society kind of participating here. Or whenever, or if ever Celine Dion were to pass away, this is her funeral, right? And the whole world could kind of come here and commemorate it. So that's one reference. And the other is the steeple, which is no longer there, but how do we maybe quietly but also powerfully commemorate it? So what about just putting this cross, suspending it in the air at the same spot where the steeple would have stood in the 1670s? And it makes reference to the other famous cross that's on Mont-Royal. Now, the next kind of moment that might have influenced the spirit of our office is the October crisis and kind of that really pivotal moment of tension where the French majority were really asserting the power shift. And I think a lot of the Anglophones living in Montreal were afraid, many of them left. But it was a period where the War Measures Act in October of 1970 was enacted, and people were terrified. I remember talking to Claude about this, and he remembers as a kid being terrified, seeing tanks running down the streets of Montreal. And for those in the rest of Canada, it was a really tense moment. There were murders, there were bombs, there were terrorist activities. It was a really tense moment. And I think for someone who had been kind of growing up as a kid in this era, to see the public realm as a stage for divisiveness, I think it would have left its mark. And an ethos behind a lot of our work is how to make places of universal appeal, how to create a public realm that can kind of accommodate the diversity that is the world, but also to make it in a way that is particular and specific to each individual. So it can make sense, it becomes meaningful, not just to the group, but also to the individual. And we were doing HTO with Janet Rosenberg Studio in 2003, 2002 for the competition. This was the kind of the kickoff of the concept. It's a painting by Seurat. And if you look at this kind of moment, this is 1886 or 1884, the L'Afternoon at the Grand Jatte. And if you look at the people, different classes, different ethnicities, different ages, but you notice everybody's kind of comfortably occupying the same space in a kind of a nonchalant manner. And if you look what they're looking, there's kind of this triangulation offered by the horizon. That's that moment of universal appeal. It allows people who maybe don't even like each other to coexist, but at the same time allows you to be with other people and develop a kind of an empathy just from being present among other people. And this is kind of something we developed in our work, and it still continues today. So this is an installation we did in 2004 when I was an intern. And the concept for this was called the Blue Tree, was to kind of use a Photoshop eraser, pixel by pixel, erasing this tree at the Garden Festival. They were going to cut this tree down because it was diseased, and we said, no, keep this tree, we're going to use it. And we made, I guess, pixel by pixel, and we made the tree disappear, because the sky in California is almost always blue. But it was curious because there was a 5-year-old son of the owner of the garden who was sitting under one day and told his father, you know, Dad, the sky's not blue. He says, what do you mean? Well, this tree is blue, right? It's a blue tree. But when I look at the blue in the tree and the sky behind it, it's always changing. The blue is always changing depending on where the light is coming from the east or the west or different kinds of atmospheric conditions. It's kind of a sophisticated epiphany for a 5-year-old. But it's true. So in the end, it kind of made us realize it's not about this. This is not the vedette. It's not the superstar attracting attention. It's what it does in terms of deflecting your attention to the context. So that's what I think from a landscape move. It helps you to maybe appreciate the context more than the object itself. The object is interesting maybe for a few minutes. You get bored of it pretty soon because it's pretty straightforward. But what happens behind it actually becomes, you start paying attention to it. And the same thing happened for one of our more recent projects that opened last year, The Ring in Montreal. This is kind of the high mass of modernist doctrine, Place Ville-Marie, the whole complex. All the rules were followed to a T and perfected. And this is kind of a very important pivotal moment in the architectural trajectory of Montreal. Fantastic building, even to this day, 60 years later. And interestingly enough, it's being repopulated less by finance and more by architects and galleries, which is an interesting moment. So you have a chance maybe to visit because there's a public space on the top of the building as well. But this was I am Pei and Henry Cobb, more Cobb than Pei for this particular project. But it needed something to be a counterpoint, to break the orthogonal rhythm, the logic of this very, very kind of geometrically defined space. And this was the idea to kind of do that. It was the anniversary. It was also the end of the pandemic. It was a moment or a gesture that the client, the owner of the property, wanted to relaunch downtown, to provide this kind of gateway public moment that really made it, put it on the map again. I remember when this first came to the office wondering, do we do this project? I mean, what do you do? It's such a significant heritage building in the city, and how can you make it better? But just looking at the geometry, right? You have these two little jogs on the existing building. You have this kind of 30-meter separation, and just this circle kind of fit just clearly enough to be just overhead of those passing on the newly built staircase just below. If you look down, like he's just passing underneath. If you raise your arms, you can almost touch it. And it worked. And you almost have this tangible connection with infinity, where you have this almost impossible object, which is just over your fingertips. And it's surprising the reaction that it generated. But also, from a landscape point of view, it reframed, it gave new eyes on a very kind of iconic view. 200 years of city building along this axis that goes through the gates of McGill University, the Royal Victoria Hospital. It's kind of that Hogwarts view you see when you're looking from the esplanade of Place Ville-Marie, all the way to the cross at the summit. It's a very significant postcard moment, and it kind of provided a fresh perspective on a very old view. But also, from a landscape architecture point of view, it took us out of our comfort zone. Hanging a 15-ton object, 30 meters diameter, in the air requires a lot of precision and a lot of coordination, safety issues that we had never had to consider before. Even the hoisting of this object was a challenge. But it went up, and this is kind of Claude on the opening ceremony. It was a fantastic event, done in Montreal fashion. There's Ariane Moffett, a famous Quebec singer, suspended in the middle of the air singing her song. Circus artists descending the building. It was amazing. But what was most amazing was just this aspect of triangulation. Montreal is not necessarily the most maybe unified city. People don't necessarily speak the same language, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But at this moment, and we have a new employee from Olin's office in Philadelphia, and he said this for him was the first time he felt like a Montrealais, like a citizen of Montreal. And it's kind of that moment where everybody is made to feel Montrealais. And here's Claude with his back saying, what the fuck? I mean, look what people are doing. I never realized that this is happening. And it's kind of a dizzy moment where all the stress and all the difficulties that every day this project brought new challenges. Every day we said we're quitting, we're not going to do this project. But in the end, when this moment happens, it says, yes, it was worth it. Now, another influence I would say in the life, I guess, of all landscape architects, but particularly in Claude Cormier in the relationship to Montreal, is Frederick Law Olmsted, right? He has an agricultural background, a very pragmatic person, understanding of the land, but also he was a journalist. He understood the role of narrative in creating something that's singular and unified as an experience. And just interestingly enough, this was Montreal before Parc de Montréal was built. This was a landowner who decided to start cutting trees to sell his firewood. And the city below started freaking out. They said, what's going on? And they demanded the city to appropriate the mountain, which they did. And in good foresight, they hired Olmsted after Central Park to come and do Parc de Montréal. And we're so grateful, because take the park out of Montreal and you won't have the same place. The other side, though, I would say is Martha Schwartz. Claude interned with her, met her when he was at Harvard, and she was a huge influence and almost the diametric opposite of Olmsted, you would think. But she was almost like Deschamps, who brought the urinal to the museum. He took art from one side of the brain and put it into the other. And she brought the idea back. After 10 years of Ian McHarg and environmental determinism, she brought the human agency, or at least admitted human agency, back into design, and brought culture and art back into, and the idea and concept. And it was quite significant. And some might even say, this is her bagel garden, 1979. She might have been taking something very serious, like a traditional, this almost looks like a French parterre kind of garden, and making it a joke, putting bagels in for a very low budget sensation. But this was like the urinal of Duchamp. This was a tipping point. It was titanic in what it was able to do and transform the profession. This was Landscape Architecture magazine, 1979, and as far as I understand, the editor was fired shortly after this came out, and a lot of people canceled their subscriptions. But it changed the world, right? Martha Schwartz, love her or hate her, she changed the profession. And so this is Claude as a kid, and he was giving a master class for Michael van Valkenburg studio at GSD one year, and there was a student who had to write an essay on what she was able to interpret. And notice that Claude Cormier was almost like the offspring of, the father was Olmsted, and the mother was Martha. And it's kind of true. He's like the dialectic that unifies these two opposites. And I remember running into Martha at a conference and saying, you know what people were saying? That Claude is the son of you and Frederick Law Olmsted. And she laughed and said, yes, Fred was amazing. So this was kind of the tipping point, Claude's Bagel Garden, the Blue Stick Garden, which was the inaugural festival at Jardin Métis in Gaspésie. And you might think this was kind of that idea of artificial, not fake, colors, not a decoration, these kind of really important kind of tenets of the design process. And these are all not just whimsy. It wasn't driven by whimsy, but driven by reality and pragmatics. Claude grew up on a farm, right? He grew up in a sugar bush. Very practical approach to life, despite what you might think when you look at the work. But look at, for example, in Gaspésie, a very short growing season. It's almost in the middle of nowhere. It's about 3.5 hours drive from Montreal. So you're going to expect people to come to a garden festival, spending all their time and significant resources to get there, just to see petunias that might be blooming? No. We have to give them something that's going to really punch them in the gut from the day one to the day that it closes. And that's what this was aiming to do, this kind of juxtaposition between a natural context and this highly artificial garden with no plants. Like, who thought a garden with no plants? This was the first kind of maquette, and it was only blue, right? Blue Stick Garden, very simple, straightforward name. And the reaction was, meh, that's it? Is that all there is? It's pretty boring. What can we do to sort of make it better? And the Blue Stick Garden, kind of in its concept, was about pixelating this icon of the garden festival, which was the Himalayan blue poppy, which had been acclimatized by Elsie Refford, who was the old kind of summer refuge for the Refford family, who lived in Montreal. And she was able to acclimatize this to the local microclimate. But, and making a garden that speaks to contemporary audiences, if you pixelate it, turning a garden from something organic to something that's digital and turning that into experience. But again, that's a side note. I just want to talk about color. Again, blue. But if you were to maybe just pimp up the color counterpoint of the blue in the center with a bit of its orange, it's already there, but just maybe exaggerate it a bit more and apply that to the garden, that already starts to provide some interest. But what really the real moment is how you're forced to move through this garden, and there's kind of a 360 or a 180-degree U-turn or pivot that you do at the end, and in an instant, the garden goes from being only blue to only orange. And people going in, not expecting anything. You hear them exclaim like, mon Dieu, there's a certain astonishment and shock to the senses that it just takes them over. And then they walk back, and on the way back, it changes from all orange back to blue, and then the gradient in between. So this need to have to condense the blooming sequence of a short season into one moment happens. The whole sort of saison de floraison, the blooming season, a 4-month blooming season condensed into a few seconds, depending on how you move through the space. It was a really significant moment. And this, I would say this kind of is the DNA that influences and informs all the work that follows, including the larger projects. And this then was also the cover of Landscape Architecture magazine. And the editor was not fired after this issue. But after this, it became really well known. It went to Gertrude Jekyll Garden in England. It even traveled to the Forks in Winnipeg during the Cool Gardens time. This was 2013. Now, kind of the next influence, and this is also something maybe from the days at Harvard, and also from my own landscape education, is landscape ecology. And people might not think, well, how does landscape ecology figure into your work? But it's really important. Landscape, remember, refers to a situation where the primary organizer is spatial arrangement. Ecology refers to the study of interactions among organisms and their environment. So put these things together, you have landscape ecology. And so Frederick is the father, Martha's the mother. I would say Richard Foreman is the uncle. Richard Foreman, who coined landscape ecology. And if anybody knows, he's at the GSD. He's an ecologist. I would say his work has been fundamental. And I think a lot of the biodiversity crisis issues right now result from, for example, fragmentation of habitats, which is all landscape ecology. And he knew that had he stayed in the ecology world, he'd be speaking to the choir. If he wanted his ideas to get implemented, he needs to teach designers. So that's where his role has been critical. Generations of landscape architects have been educated by Richard Foreman, including myself. And this is, for example, what he talks about, the importance of how form influences behavior. And I think as landscape architects, sometimes we're suspect of form. Like architects are really great because all they do is make forms. I think landscape architects are good at understanding systems and connections, but we're not so comfortable with forms. But it's not just a decoration. Form is fundamental. Form is life or death, right? And I think a lot of the instinction issues are resulted because of land management and this sort of neglect of the importance of form. Like for example, this form here, this kind of patch, the way that these little tendrils reach out creates a large enough patch for maybe higher order mammals to have enough space to reproduce and not sort of weaken the DNA of their breeds, but also providing tendrils to be able to move to other patches. And kind of the metaphor was, you have a rabbit, how's that bunny rabbit going to travel from place to place without getting killed? And for example, here we have two patches connected with these little stepping stones. You take one of those stepping stones away, and those two patches become fragmented. So this is really fundamental. And so we took this concept for a project in Toronto, the Evergreen Brickworks that we did with DTH. And this was the concept. And we were competing against some other teams, but it was a really convincing concept. This is 1889 when the brickworks opened. This is the 1980s when it shut down, when the clay deposit was depleted. And the client, Evergreen, they're kind of an environmental nonprofit that aims to green cities. And they're all across Canada, but this is their mothership. They wanted to have like an anchor watt in the middle of the Don Valley, not too far from downtown, where you have this, but how do you allow nature to do this to that? And that was the challenge. And one of the things that's really great about Toronto, it's just accidentally interconnected by this system of ravines. And so the city kind of stops to allow for these interconnected, they're highly degraded, but they're interconnected. So they go from the Oak Ridges moraine beyond the city's suburbs and connect all the way to Lake Ontario. So this amazing connective tissue in the city, which is a result of a hurricane, I think 1957, Hurricane Hazel, where because these were all flooded and loss of life and loss of property, there's no longer a permission to be able to develop these ravines. And so that has resulted in this really well-connected network. So how do we build into that? And so conceptually, looking at these flows, these systems that are moving through the valley, natural systems like the top of the bank where you have kind of the top of the tree cover, the bottom of the tree cover, which represents kind of seeds, lines that might represent seed flows, rivers, creeks, but also human flows. You have highways, you have power lines, railroads, indiscriminately, not judging between what's natural, what's not natural, just laying them all out there. And kind of observing this building that has resulted after these almost a century of industrial use, heavy industrial use, turned into this kind of monolith which truncated a lot of these flows. And if you look at the history of the footprint, we thought, wow, it kind of evolved from a village into this monolith. Why don't we try to reopen it and turn it back into a village? Take the roof off, allow these passages to come through. And that's what we did, and it kind of worked. Taking the roof off the building allowed for these flows and water and seed and animals to be able to pass through the building and maybe even colonize it. And so this was the starting point where we were planting a few trees to get us started. But it worked. The seeds of the valley sets themselves onto these blank canvases of soil and were able to express themselves on the space. So that was a pure manifestation of Richard Foreman's ecological kind of relationship between form, connectivity, and ecology. But that's not the most interesting part. I think from another point, we're also organisms, not just about rabbits, but also humans. And how does the spatial arrangement of what you call landscape also affect human behavior? And this is what makes it interesting. This was 1990. This is the business nightclub, which was the Studio 54 of Montreal at that time, where they would discriminate amongst clients outside lining up on the street saying, yes, you, no, no. It was very kind of the scene, the place to be. And I guess this is before Claude had gone to Harvard. It was a very early project, 1990, keeping in mind he founded the office in 1995. And remember that he grew up on a farm, and for his 16th birthday, he got a chainsaw. So these were things he knew. He knew how to cut wood. He knew about forests. But I think what he was interested in, it was this kind of moment. What does a spatial arrangement within the context of a nightclub allow you to do? It allows you to maybe, well, look at Little Red Riding Hood, flirting with the wolf, not running from the wolf, looking to see if anybody's watching. It kind of creates these personal spaces, but also public enough to be safe, to kind of influence how people behave. And just curiously, I was asking, like, Claude, how did you get such a great commission without really having any experience? He says, oh, I was dating the bartender. So it kind of sometimes thinks maybe Grindr is better for networking than LinkedIn. But it's interesting enough. That was an early evolution, but later on, in a more mature manifestation of that same thinking came the lipstick forest, which was as part of a turnkey project, which was led by a contractor. The client didn't really know what they were getting. They just knew they were going to get the project at a certain price with a competent set of designers and builders. And the concept here was in the brief, was for a winter garden, which normally means like a tropical greenhouse. And the point was, the last thing Montreal needs, and it's not very sustainable, to be trucking in plants from Costa Rica and then keeping them on life support. What Montreal needs in winter is color. And so relating to kind of the brand of the city at that time, created the lipstick forest. And also kind of manifesting the iconography of the streetscapes, these alleys of silver maples with big trunks. And this shortly after the ice storm, where a lot of them lost their tops and it was just only the trunks. And taking that as the winter garden, but also playing upon other notions of the cosmetic industry of Montreal, the joie de vivre, the Palais des Congrès, which is the convention center, and the kind of the cliche of having an extramarital affair when you're on lipstick on your collar, when you go to conferences. And then when this happened, and this is what I'm talking about, where the language there's no words to describe something that's kind of new, so it's challenging for the general public until the language can catch up. And this is shortly after it was open to the public, the Journal de Montréal, which is the tabloid, saying, c'est horrible. And this is, I was saying, Claude was saying, this was the best review we ever got for any project. It was fantastic. C'est horrible. And Frederick Metz was a graphic art professor at UQAM, very respected, and he said, no, I love this project, they misquoted me. But just taking, for example, alcohol is good for children, other kinds of things that were not kind of accurate. But interestingly enough, too, at the times, I think, again, the language is not there, but the impulse is there, the instinct, the visceral intelligence there to kind of push these projects through. And even when the client didn't know they were getting this, so I remember the architect of the building phoning Claude one day and saying, Claude, are you sure? Are you sure this is what you want to do? And then the day that the pink trunks arrived to be installed, the construction workers doing this work were locked out of the building and were called names. So you could just kind of sense, oh, well, what's that about? I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But finally, when the language caught up, it became the cover page of the travel book for Montreal. So just kind of this interesting evolution. Now, kind of building upon this random placement of objects, I'm going to talk about Sugar Beach in Toronto, which also is based on that kind of logic. This is a competition from Waterfront Toronto, one of the earliest projects in Waterfront Toronto that kind of kicked off the transformation of the Toronto waterfront. So before, Toronto waterfront was industrial. People didn't go here for fun. They went to Muskoka, 2 hours away north of the city. And even the city, it evolved along Yonge Street, almost a perpendicular opposite of the lake. So this was not a place you wanted to go. And that started to change in maybe the 1990s. And the competition came, and we were surprised to win it. And this was shortly after it opened. And so that was before. After its life as an industrial port, it was a storage, film studio, UPS building, parking lot. And there's kind of the same point of view before and after. And this is shortly after the trees. This was a great learning curve for us to learn how to plant trees and the relationship of soil volumes and trees. And we really learned a lot on this project. And you can just see over a short period of time how quickly the trees were able to grow. And just seeing how, similar to maybe the nightclub installation, how you position objects influences behavior. And what we notice on a lot of our projects like this is how people relax their personal space. And you see people doing very personal, almost intimate kind of activities, almost naked in, for example, the beach condition, but not uncomfortable, being comfortable in these states close to other people who are also in those states. And there's certain design experience or intuition that how you position objects influences how people are going to occupy it and how they're going to feel in those spaces. But one thing I want to talk about is this kind of the umbrella. There's a few controversies that came around the umbrella. And one that came from a car-dominated councillor, a councillor from a car-dominated neighborhood. This was in the Rob Ford years, which came after Sugar Beach opened. And you remember, it was all kind of, everything was very sort of fiscally defined as too expensive, not cheap enough. And this was a councillor kind of with his arms folded and shoulders shrugged saying, these umbrellas? He heard the price tag of the umbrellas. He was scandalized, and it became a big controversy. And it was fun for us just to watch back and watch the public debate, because it was a debate on civic values. And so you kind of have a suburban attitude, which is thinking it's like their average daily life, people who live in the suburbs, is about maybe 80 kilometers an hour, where everything is oversized and the standards are safe for people traveling at 80 kilometers an hour, compared maybe to more sort of urban experiences, which are more like pedestrian at 8 kilometers an hour. So different senses of scale where everything is very fine detailed. A stop sign like this on this route would not work. And I think it just kind of relates to a generational of logic from maybe the 1950s until maybe the 1990s or 2000, where there's kind of an engineer logic where there's a problem and there's a solution, like an engineer-driven solution, which doesn't really consider like a design thinking as opposed to other offshoots or spin-offs and other aspects to that problem-solving scenario. And in the end, I think people kind of went with this camp to realize that it is worth spending money on. And people were saying, why don't you just go to Home Depot? I mean, I can get an umbrella from Home Depot for $90. Well, this is HTO when it opened. The city went to Home Depot and got some Adirondack chairs for just the opening ceremony. And they were really successful, and they said, well, let's keep them. And then within a couple of months, they turned into this. They had fallen apart, and they were useless, maybe even dangerous. And so the umbrella, too, could be dangerous. People could lose their life, because I think some of Christo's umbrellas got lifted in the air and killed someone. And you don't know what's going to happen. Designing for the public has to be really robust, has to be ready for any kind of possibilities. So it's a really robust stainless steel structure with 1 centimeter thick pipe. It couldn't be a $90 object from Home Depot. So, but taking that logic, that sort of suburban logic where, make it cheap, we thought, okay, let's take away the umbrellas. Fine, still a nice park. But planting trees and soil cells, that also is really expensive. Maybe in today's dollars, $15,000, $20,000 a tree. It's crazy. Let's get rid of the trees. And that sand, that sand comes from Ohio. It's pretty expensive. Let's get rid of that too. And then you kind of have what you came from. And this maybe from the suburban 80 kilometer an hour point of view, when you have a car, this is amazing because I can find parking downtown. But the other values had led to so many spin-offs where it was used for movies, it was on the cover of Topos, which is the cover of travel magazines. It really became a brand for the city. And just the way people reacted to this. This is what landscape architects live for. When people say, these are the moments I live for. This is exactly why we want to be landscape architects, right? To create moments where people are moved to really feel joy. And so I think in the end, the public debate on this went with the 8 kilometer an hour camp. But another thing too, this idea of humor and the visceral intelligence during the design review panel was also challenging. There's just an umbrella, and a pink umbrella maybe, but it didn't realize it was going to be such an issue. So one of the people in the design review panel at Waterfront Toronto said, well, is it big enough? Can I fit my family? And sort of prove them for Christmas, we sent out Christmas cards with the Holy Family under the umbrella, a little maquette that we had of the umbrella, and said, if it's big enough for the Holy Family, it's big enough for your family. But there were also others on the design panel, some of the older maybe guys on the panel saying, well, you're not going to see me sitting under a pink umbrella. And it was kind of like, what? Well, why not? Because for us, the pink was an aesthetic choice. Originally on the concept when we were in competition, it was going to be all colors, like red and blue and green, like a bowl of jujubes. But we looked at it and thought, it's a bit too much. It's a bit of a sugar rush. And it's a bit distracting. So this is an unforgettable moment. Jackie Kennedy in Dallas. Jackie Kennedy pink, right? Who can forget this? It's fantastic. And just the way that, the pink worked with the blue, in the winter with the white of the snow, with the gray clouds, it just worked. Chromatically, it was a nice contrast with everything else. It was that pop moment again to draw you to the background. But pink is also, it's a choice you have to make. There's lots of kinds of pink, and this is the kind of pink maybe I see at the dentist's office, and maybe this is the kind I might see when I go to Dunkin' Donuts. So no, we settled on Pantone 189C. That was the right one. Again, and this is very important, color is not a decoration, it's a deliberate choice which has a huge impact on the experience of a place. So, bring in some humor, and I was saying before, maybe like, people might say like Martha Schwartz takes a joke and takes something serious and turns it into a joke, so it's kind of like a ha-ha at the end. I think the approach here is starting with a joke, ha-ha, to engage the visceral intelligence, but at the end, you realize actually it's very serious, like, oh, ha-ha. It becomes something else. And so, but it takes a bit of time and a bit of a chance for people to catch up and get it. But it raises the question, which means they've started thinking about it. And so, this is Claude here. We used to go to a construction site with pink hard hats. And this is 2009, 2008. We thought, because the pink umbrellas are going to come at the end of the project, so let's go with pink umbrellas and just, they'll say, ha, that's why pink umbrellas came at the end. That's why those guys were wearing those pink umbrellas. But it was really weird. We were just innocently, naively wearing pink hard hats, and just the way that the construction workers would look at you, right? Say, well, what's that? Or they would talk about you. I remember once my pink hard hat was on the table, and the general contractor was lovely, but one of his sub-trades came in and says, is that your pink hard hat? To the contractor that he was hired under. He says, no, it's his. And it just kind of raised the question, well, what's going on here? There's kind of there's something, color is not just aesthetic, but it's political, which really didn't phase into the equation when we were choosing colors. And so it kind of clued in. This is Jimmy Kimmel and his friend Rodrigo Guillermo. They came to Toronto to do kind of a piece, because I think Jimmy Kimmel had insulted Rob Ford, so to make peace, he came and did a piece on Toronto during the film festival. And they went to Sugar Beach and they fell in love. That was the perspective. And that kind of raised this question about, well, what's going on here? And I think that kind of raised this aspect. Another fundamental component to the work I say is very important is this element of queer joy. And I don't think there was really a word for it. And maybe I have to maybe explain it a little bit. But queer joy, and I think overall, how do you create this moment of joy so that if you don't identify as queer, for example, how do you make other people feel that same sensation? And I'll try to go into detail what that means. But queer joy, I think everybody's repressed in some way, just the way our society is structured. We have to do roles and we can't necessarily be ourselves in all situations. Like for example, when you know, it's hard sometimes to express happiness. You see something beautiful and sometimes it's easier just to kind of force it, no reaction, as opposed to letting it really kind of spill out. how to create moments that let everybody feel unable to contain it, right? It touches a desire in such a way, it emancipates your ability to express your response to that desire, whether you're queer or not. But I think that value, that ethos comes from this aspect of queer joy. And I may want to talk about it, hold on, let's back up a little bit here. This was an example, kind of just came across my radar in the last couple of years, this Zeki Müren. He was a Turkish musician, kind of like the Liberace of Turkey. That's how people kind of coin him in North America, in the West. And he's a national treasure. So despite his sensational qualities, but there's a story that's interesting. It might speak to this element of queer joy and the universal appeal of that queer joy moment. And there was a moment that I had heard where he was giving a concert, and there's a gang of people came with sticks and rocks. They were going to beat him up. And they came into the theater, and he saw them coming. He says, "Oh, you guys want to beat me up? Okay, well, just let me sing you a song first, okay?" So he sang them a song, and after that one moment, they were all touched. The desires were all engaged. They put their rocks and sticks down, and they just enjoyed themselves. And I think that kind of speaks to what that is. And this is kind of a funny moment. We were being interviewed for a project, and the firm, kind of just a bread and butter firm, was doing the interview without really caring about the design aspects of the project, more the delivery and the logistics and the cost control of the project. So they wanted to say, are you cheapest? Are you going to be the fastest? Are you LEED certified? All of those kind of, people who wear tie moments. This is not working anymore. There. So we're on this really surreal phone call, and I'm just quickly drawing a sketch on the side because it's just so weird. So this is kind of what they're looking for. Who's the lowest bidder? And this is us on the side. Who's the lowest bidder? Not me, because there's another value that we, in addition to we're not expensive necessarily. We're not going to make expensive projects. But if you're going to choose a designer based on those criteria only, then go and find someone else, because it's not interesting. And why do we want to work on it if it's not interesting? But the idea of queer joy, this is some photographs from Belmont Rocks in Chicago in 1985 by David Isser. And I think it just captures what I'm trying to get across. What was 1985? What was going in 1985, right? I think the civil rights discussion, the conversation at that time from maybe starting quite a bit earlier, but I would say it really became intense between the 80s and maybe the like maybe 2010, where if you turn on the radio, especially in the 80s and 90s, every day the radio was talking about AIDS, and people dying, and gay rights, and everything like that. And people were just getting, maybe we're not interested in those conversations, just were getting sick of it because it was always there. And so you can think 1985, what was going on? This is kind of the peak when the mystery virus was killing everybody in their community. So you can imagine the level of fear and all the other kind of reasons to be invisible. People would lose their jobs, lose their families, lose their friends, lose their social status if they couldn't keep their secret. And if you imagine in the few places where you could go and express yourself authentically, it was transcendental. That's what the queer joy aspect is about. You're feeling safe, but also your humanity is expressed in its full form. And this is the same location a few years later, right? Queer forever right there, but it's empty. Everybody was afraid because their friends were dying, or they were dead. And they were invisible. They couldn't talk to anybody about it. Even Claude at this time, because he would have finished his U of T degree and started his first job in Toronto as a landscape architect. When was that? Maybe late 80s? And he talked about when his landlady learned that he was gay, she disinfected the whole building. She brought the Javex out and started disinfecting. His roommate at the time was dying of AIDS. And he'd leave for work saying, "Don't die today, wait till I come back." And so it was really kind of under the radar for kind of mainstream society until it wasn't. This is the same location. The Army Corps of Engineers kind of sanitized the area, reinforced the breakwaters. And we were approached with a request, a pro bono request, just to explore the idea of, we were working in Chicago on another project, to explore the idea of an AIDS memorial. Chicago didn't have one. And so this is the area of the Belmont Rocks, where those rocks and those photos were taken, all kind of reconstructed with this breakwater. And the idea of creating a memorial that didn't necessarily mourn or commemorate the losses, but creating a space that reflects the joy, that if they were still alive, what would they be doing here? And the idea was to kind of create this gradient of umbrellas across this is maybe like 1 kilometer long. It was a bit too grandiose for the clients, so they were not interested. They just wanted to put a statue, which got put up right here. But the idea of maybe everybody could sponsor it. I mean, Chicago is a big city. The Midwest, from Denver to Pittsburgh and Minneapolis to Nashville, whatever, that big area, Chicago is kind of an epicenter, there's a lot of people who might want to commemorate a loved one. And even though the umbrellas might not be so cheap, I think there'd be enough resource to be able to have donations build this all out. So it becomes a real, you could go and sit under the umbrella that you paid for to commemorate your brother. And, but unfortunately it didn't happen. But where we did have a chance to maybe express this queer joy into the general public is in Pink Balls in the gay village of Montreal. And it was really interesting to see what happened. We were approached by the BIA of the village, which at that time was a really sad neighborhood. It was a ghetto. This is where kind of all the rejects of society would go. So it became not only the gay ghetto with the typical kind of accoutrement of gay culture at that time, but you have a lot of drug use, a lot of prostitution, a lot of homelessness. It was not a very nice neighborhood. And this neighborhood, it moved here in the 70s. Jean Drapeau, the mayor during Expo and the Olympics in 1976, this kind of gay institutions or the scene was on the west side of downtown on Crescent Street, which is now kind of the nightclub for other reasons district for non-queer identified people. So they moved here in 1960s, 1970s because they were pushed out through police raids, and eventually the lives were made so uncomfortable they moved, and this is where they moved to. And so they came to us and we asked us to make a proposal. And so we proposed a scheme, suspending a canopy of pink balls for the 1 kilometer length between the over three subway stations along this main axis of downtown Montreal. And everything worked out. We were going to get balls from China, but that didn't work out because they were too flammable. So we made them in Quebec. We got the local community, and it's almost like the community was getting ready to host. It was setting up its house, cleaning house to host the whole city. And they were so proud. And it really transformed the neighborhood. The vacancy rate went from 20% to 7% after the first year. People were moving back. People might be critical, saying, well, it kind of maybe straight washed, or it kind of de-gayed the neighborhood. But from our point of view, it kind of went from being just a gay ghetto to someplace that everybody went to. It became part of the tourist circuit. People went there with their families and kids. It became that kind of moment where everybody was kind of encouraged to just enjoy themselves. This is a short video that was made, I think, after the second edition. I'm going to show it to you. Just interested to see how a piece of landscape architecture spins off other forms of culture and expression. And this is just kind of a day in the life of the village. It moved on to become, the last versions of it became multicolored, 18 Shades of Gay. And this was the last kind of expression. 2019, it kind of ended. But it was used for advertising. The advertising budget was bigger than actually the budget for the project itself. And in the end, it was people they paid to take some of the balls home to put in their house, and the money was used to generate a competition for an idea that would follow, which has yet to follow. And if you go to Montreal now, the village has descended back into its sorry state. So it definitely needs something. Okay, I'm going to be quick with what's left. Just a few other maybe elements fundamental to how we work is Montreal as Tower of Babel. I was talking before how a lot of people don't speak the same language. In our office, some people only speak French, some people only speak English, and everything in between. When Claude went to university in Guelph, he didn't even speak English. So the idea to be really clear in your message. And that's why everything has to be really straightforward. This is Love Park in Toronto, under construction. And you might roll your eyes thinking, well, that's stupid. You have a little lake next to a big lake. It's in the shape of a heart. It's a bit too literal. But it's actually very serious. And it's meant to be like a metropolitan love seat that replaced this off-ramp of the freeway that was demolished. And it's meant to be delicious. The icon in this kind of very boring skyscraper neighborhood where everything looks the same, creating something of an icon. This is a Lake Toon in Japan where people rent helicopters and get marriage proposals flying over this heart, which maybe they'll do over Love Park at some point as well. But I just want to talk a little bit about the making of this love seat. It's finished. The love seat is finished, but it's meant to be a cameo. There's many shades of red to mimic kind of the abstracted rose. And it's made with hand-laid tile with a fantastic mosaic workshop. There's 4 in the world that can do this, and one of them happens to be in Montreal. And they just did a fantastic job creating this 170-meter long mosaic around the pond. So this will be opening in the spring. So if you go to Toronto, you can go there. Just a bit more talking about the role of beauty to transform people. If you touch people's desire, this is Babette's Feast. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you've ever seen it, how pleasure can activate a refusal to go back to the status quo. This was a garden festival in France called Salange. This was the name of Claude's mother, where he dressed up these very masculine trees in kind of this sort of floral fabric. And just looking at how the adults look at it, like, what's it made out of? You can see their wrinkled foreheads. You look at the kids just saying, oh, c'est beau, you know, this is fantastic. Well, we weren't really thinking about what's going on. And the last project I want to talk about is Berksea Park. Again, this idea of triangulation was a park revitalization of an existing park in this kind of what was left of the old fabric of the city. It was all kind of built to build those freeways that took people to the suburbs. All the old buildings were demolished to build parking lots. But the city's changed since then. A lot of people moved here with families, with pets. The park had to do a lot for a big number of people. It used to be the site of Woofstock, the largest dog festival in North America. And it was interesting to see what the neighborhood wanted, because they were unable to agree on between themselves what they wanted. The BIA wanted a postcard to attract tourists and business. Parents wanted a place for their kids to play. They actually wanted a playground, but we thought, well, maybe we can do something with one thing that can please everybody. And then the dog owners wanted something for their pets. So we created a little dog trough with fresh water for them to be able to drink. And it became that moment of triangulation where instead of giving one person one thing and the other group nothing, we gave them something that satisfied them all. So instead of looking at each other, they looked at something higher that exceeded their expectations. Now I'm just going to close off to talk about from this to this. We talk about how police raids in the village forced the village to move in the 70s. And this is during the student protests about maybe 10 years ago. And Giselle Lullaby, drag queen of the village, saying, look at this moment, right? Where is the power now? The power dynamic has changed. We talk about emancipation movements from the Quebecois majority in the 60s and 70s, so for gay rights in the 80s, 90s, and 90s. And just where is this conversation now? Because definitely this is not the conversation necessarily anymore. The conversation has pivoted, I would say, to biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, but also racial justice, reconciliation, right? And this is Kent Monkman. So this is 2002, where he might have been playing within the previous conversation that might have entered the public imagination through this queer window, but looking at how do we talk about re-narrating power relationships. And then you look at something more recent. This is, I think, from the protest, the pipeline protest in North Dakota from 2016. Again, Kent Monkman, but it's real. So in a way, playing from a surreal point of view, the reflux global moment, to get this into the imagination so that you can have a real conversation. And that's where we are right now. So I think the question is now for designers to make room for those voices to lead those discussions. Because it's the same. The power struggle is the same. It's just different in its detail, but ultimately it's the same phenomenon. Okay, sorry for going over time, but thank you very much.
What we'll do is we'll take a few questions and just advance the program a little bit. So we'll start with Connor maybe at 11:40. Are there any questions for Ken? Or for Mark?
I wish. Could you speak a bit more about color? I'm thinking there's a book recently called Chromophobia. Oh, okay, yeah, I recommend it. Yeah. It's just this one aspect of the work that's really phenomenal.
Yeah. I think people are afraid of color, at least in maybe North American culture. Maybe not so much like in certain more southern climates, but I don't know what that is. I think it's maybe part of that repression about the resistance to express joy. I think there's kind of an Anglo-Saxon perspective where you kind of stoic is the value, and we're trying to maybe counter that because color definitely has a reaction. And when you're choosing a color, it's not easy. For example, if you had a studio where you had to use a color, it'd be interesting to watch your students kind of wrinkle their forehead saying, well, what makes sense? So it's not an easy choice. Sometimes it's the hardest choice to make is what color is it going to be, because you got to live with it. And if it's the wrong choice, you get bored of it really quickly. It has to have a meaning. Any other questions? All right. Oh, John.
Continue a little bit from what we were discussing yesterday. We're very focused right now on differences, right? Our politics are about identity and emphasizing the differences or what makes us distinct. And I think it's an issue. And when we look at the projects here in the past decades of the firm, I think that the idea that something like fun, you mentioned that a few times in the presentation, is a common denominator. It's one of those things that seems so banal in some ways that it actually brings us together. So do you see that this is still relevant, even in the context of moments like the one that's on the screen right now?
I think
where we are at.
I think it's more relevant. I mean, it's part of pleasure activism. If you can speak to people's desires, they're not going to settle for an unfulfilling life, right? When you wake that up, I think it's hard to put back into its box. But I think also by creating, at least in real life, I think social media is keeping this, I think is actually being exploited because somebody's benefiting from this divisiveness. And I think the lack of actual encounter with each other is maybe a problem. I think all of us probably have 95% more in common with each other than we are different, right? But we don't have a chance because all we're focusing on the difference. But if you have a chance, like even with the Seurat painting, if we have a chance to share a space, a public realm together in a way that we're just being around each other, the presence of each other, we're empathetic. That's human nature. You like each other. And I think that is necessary to undo the divisiveness. So yes, I think.
I'd like to say thank you, Marc, so much for sharing ideas that I know many of us tried to push in our studio work. So I just think it's so great, your presentation. Thank you.
So we'll show the video at lunchtime, yeah?
Yeah, so we'll show the video on that.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. All right.